This plot looks perfect. Flat, green, dry underfoot, the kind of ground you'd never think twice about. And it will quietly swallow a house, not in a dramatic collapse, but over years, one corner sinking a little deeper than the rest, until the walls crack, the doors jam, and the floors run downhill. The ground didn't fail. It's doing exactly what this kind of ground always does. The buyer just couldn't see it, because the warning was never on the surface. It was meters below, written in the soil. I read land for a living, the data under it, across dozens of countries. And this is one of the most expensive mistakes you can make buying land. It's also one of the most avoidable, if you know what you're standing on. The ground that eats houses. Why some plots keep sinking for decades, and how to spot them before you buy. Here's the idea everything hangs on. When you stand on a plot, you feel the top of the ground, a firm crust, dry and reassuring. But a building doesn't load the crust. Its weight presses down, deep into whatever lies beneath, and that's where the trouble hides. Some soils are like a sponge that's been sitting in water for 10,000 years. Put a load on them, and they don't crush suddenly. They slowly squeeze the water out and compact, sinking under the weight for years. The surface lies. The plot can feel rock solid under your boots and still sit on meters of soil that will compress under a house. So the question is never, does this ground feel firm? It's, what's underneath, and how will it behave when I put a building on it? Let me introduce the worst offender. Peat. It's soil made almost entirely of partly rotted plant matter, ancient bog, compressed over millennia, and it can be most of what's holding up a beautiful green field. Peat has two properties that make it a foundation's nightmare. First, it's astonishingly compressible. It can be more than 80% water by volume, so under a load it keeps squeezing down for years, far more than sand or firm clay ever would. Second, it has very low bearing capacity. It simply can't carry much weight before it gives. And there's a vicious twist. If the land is drained, for farming, for development, even by a neighbor's works, the peat dries, oxidizes, and shrinks, so the ground drops even without a building on it. Whole regions of lowland Europe are slowly sinking for exactly this reason. A house on untreated peat doesn't just settle once and stop. It can keep moving for the life of the building. And the cruel part is that peat is often invisible from the surface. A lush green meadow can be the most treacherous ground of all. Now here's the subtlety that separates a real problem from a harmless one. If a whole building sinks evenly, every corner dropping the same amount, it's often fine. The house just sits a little lower, doors still close, walls stay straight. Uniform settlement is rarely the disaster. The killer is differential settlement, when one part sinks more than another. And that's almost always what happens, because soil is never perfectly uniform. One end of the plot sits on slightly deeper soft ground, where the load isn't even, and one corner drops while another holds. That difference is what tears a building apart. Diagonal cracks climbing the walls, floors sloping, window frames racking out of square, doors that won't latch. This is why it's all sinking, so it's fine, is dangerously wrong. It's the difference that destroys, not the depth. And it's why you can't judge a plot by the house next door looking level today. The question is how unevenly your particular building, with its particular weight, will settle into this particular ground. Which is exactly what a soil investigation exists to answer. Now the showcase, and it's the best on earth. The Netherlands has been fighting soft, sinking ground for 1,000 years. Most of the country is reclaimed bog and marine clay. If anyone was going to master the subsurface, it was them. And they have. The Dutch built a national subsurface register, they call it the BRO, and a 3D model of the ground called geotop that slices the entire country into a grid of little blocks, each one tagged with what the soil actually is at that depth. On top of that sits one of the densest networks of soil probes anywhere. Millions of cone penetration tests, where a probe is pushed into the ground and measures the resistance meter by meter. The result is genuinely astonishing. In much of the Netherlands, you can look up, for a given plot, a 3D picture of the soil layers beneath it before you ever break ground. That is the gold standard, the richest subsurface data on the planet, born from the country with the worst subsurface problem. It's the perfect demonstration of what knowing your ground can look like. And then you cross the border, and almost nobody else has anything close. So here's the signature problem and the portable fix. Your country almost certainly does not have a Dutch-style 3D model of the ground under every plot. Almost nowhere does. But you are far from blind. Here's what you can find anywhere. First, the National Geological Survey sheet. Nearly every country publishes one, and it'll tell you the broad ground type: alluvial, peat, clay, made ground, rock. If it says peat, soft alluvium, or floodplain, your antenna goes up. Second, the plot's own history. Old maps, aerial photos, local memory. Was it a bog, a pond, a quarry, a landfill, a riverbed? Ground that was once wet or once dug is ground that will move. Third, read the neighbors. Walk the street and look at the existing buildings, diagonal cracks, patched render, doors out of square, gardens that pool water. The houses already there are a free, long-term soil test someone else paid for. And then the one rule you never break, anywhere on Earth. Before you design a foundation, get a geotechnical site investigation. Boreholes or a CPT probe on your plot. No map replaces it. The data gives you the odds. The soil test gives you the truth. Here's the reassuring part. Bad ground is almost never unbuildable. Engineers solve soft soil every day. The most common answer is piles. Long columns driven or bored straight through the soft layer down to firm ground or rock below. So the building hangs on the strong stratum and ignores the sponge above it. There are others, a thick raft that spreads the load like a snowshoe, ground improvement that strengthens the soil in place, or preloading, where you pile weight on the plot for months to squeeze the settlement out before you ever build. All of it works. But, and this is the whole point, every one of those solutions costs money, sometimes a lot, and that cost is invisible in the asking price. A cheap plot on peat that needs deep piles can end up far more expensive than a dearer plot on firm ground. So bad ground isn't a reason to walk away. It's a reason to find out before you negotiate, because the soil report doesn't just protect your building, it's a bargaining chip. The buyer who knows the foundation will cost extra is the buyer who pays the right price. The one who finds out after completion just absorbs it. Peat gets the headline, but it has accomplices. First, soft clay. Not all clay is bad, but young, soft, water-laden clay, the kind under river valleys and coastal flats, consolidates under load. It squeezes water out and compacts slowly, sometimes over many years, much like peat but quieter. A plot on deep soft clay can keep settling long after you've moved in. Second, and more insidious, made ground. That's land that isn't natural at all. Old fill, demolition rubble, former industrial yards, reclaimed tips, leveled off quarries. People love these plots because they're flat and cheap and often well located. But made ground is a lottery. It can hide voids, buried timber and rubbish that rots and collapses, wildly different materials side by side that settle at different rates. It's differential settlement waiting to happen, plus a contamination risk on top. The tell is almost always in the plot's history. If the land was ever raised, leveled, filled, or used industrially, treat the ground as guilty until a soil investigation proves it innocent. Flat and convenient is exactly the disguise the worst ground wears. Let me close the showcase with the proof standing in plain sight. Walk through old Amsterdam, and you're looking at one of the great quiet engineering achievements in Europe. Those beautiful canal houses are not sitting on the soft ground you can see. They're standing on forests of timber piles, sometimes tens of thousands per building, driven centuries ago straight down through the peat and clay to a firm layer of sand far below. The Dutch understood the rule we keep relearning. Don't fight the soft ground, bypass it. Reach the strong stratum and let it carry the load. And the cautionary half of the story is just as instructive. Where those old piles have rotted or the water table dropped and exposed them, some of those historic houses have started to tilt and sink centuries on, which tells you the ground never stops being a live problem. It just goes quiet. The civilization that built on the worst soil on the continent survived by reading the subsurface and engineering for it, deliberately, every time. That's the entire discipline, for 100 years old, and it still decides whether your house cracks. So back to that perfect-looking plot. Here's the honest answer. The ground that eats houses doesn't look dangerous. That's the whole trap. The most treacherous plots are often the flattest, greenest, most innocent ones, because soft ground makes for lovely level meadows. What separates the buyer who loses a fortune from the one who builds safely isn't luck, and it isn't the view. It's whether they read what was beneath the surface, the geology sheet, the plot's history, the cracks in the neighbor's walls, and whether they paid for the one thing you must never skip, a proper look into the soil before they designed a thing. Bad ground is survivable. You can pile through it, raft over it, improve it, or simply pay the right, lower price for it. What's not survivable is buying it blind and discovering the problem when your floors start to slope. So next time you stand on a plot that feels solid underfoot, don't trust your feet. The surface is the one part of the ground that never tells you the truth. Quick honest note. This is educational, not engineering or survey advice. For a real plot, commission a geotechnical investigation and a qualified engineer. And pulling the best available subsurface layer for any market, the 3D model where it exists, the geology sheet and history where it doesn't. That's literally the tool I built. It's called Parcella, it's mine, and the link's in the description. If reading the ground like this is your kind of thing, stick around, the channel is full of it. See you in the next one.